What's up YouTube? I'm Tom, and today we're going to go over the Fluid Sim in Blender 2.81. If you follow along with this tutorial and make something, make sure to tag me on Instagram at thomaslatvies3D. So what are Fluid Sims useful for anyway? They're used for visual effects in a lot of disaster films, something like 2012. They're used in commercials for like juices, candies, anything with liquids in a commercial. They're used in motion graphics, all sorts of advertising. So they actually do have a lot of uses that you might not realize at first. By the way, last week I made an intro to the smoke simulation in Blender 2.81, so if you haven't seen that yet, check that out, link above. And make sure to subscribe for more Blender tutorials and hit that bell for notifications for when I post. Alright, let's get started. Right away, let's just save real quick. Last tutorial, it took me about 15 minutes before I saved. Great. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with my default cube. I'm just going to scale it up to like a 5. And then I'm going to scale it along the X times 2. Just to get us a little room to play with. And I'm going to rename it in the Object Properties tab from Cube to Domain. We'll get around to why I'm doing that in a second. I'm also going to duplicate this cube, go into Wireframe View. I'm going to scale it down just a little bit. I'm scale it down on the Z a bit more. And then just bring it near the bottom of this domain cube. Maybe scale it up or along the X a little more. I'm going to rename that to Fluid. Alright, so now let's click on our domain object and let's go to the Physics tab. We're going to click on the Fluid tab, or the Fluid button, and we'll change the fluid type to domain. Makes sense. And basically what the domain is used for, much like in a smoke simulation, for the fluid simulation, the domain object is where the simulation is going to take place. So we have all these settings like resolution and time start and everything. That's basically going to affect the look of the simulation. And now we could click on our fluid object. We're going to select fluid in the physics tab again. And this time we're going to do type fluid. And what this means is it's going to use the volume of this object to create fluid right in the first frame of the simulation. It's going to basically use the size of this object to create fluid in a similar shape and volume of this object inside of the domain. There are other types of fluid objects like obstacle, which would be if you had, we're actually going to use an obstacle in this tutorial to make our splash happen. We also have inflow and outflow type objects. An inflow object is basically the equivalent of a faucet. It'll just continuously be bringing new fluid into the simulation. And an outflow object is like a drain, so that'll be pulling fluid out of the simulation. In this tutorial, we're not going to use those, but I would suggest you experiment with those. And then in terms of particle and control types, those get a little more advanced if you want to do more specific things with your fluid simulation. We're not going to go over that in this tutorial since this is a basic intro to the fluid sim, but if you're interested in learning more about those tools, comment below and let me know, and I'd love to make a tutorial going over more advanced stuff. All right, so the last thing we need to create is our obstacle object, which is going to be the text. So I'm going to go into top view, 7 on the keypad, and let's bring in a text object, hit tab to edit. And I'm just going to type fluid. And let's go into the text tab over here. I'm going to just do a few things. I'm going to change this to center and that's fine. We could rotate this on the X real quick. So with our text object selected, R, X, 90. Now we can go into front view, 1 on the numpad. I'm going to scale this up, maybe about there. And the last thing I'm going to do in this mode is I'm going to go to geometry. I'm going to extrude this out. Let's say maybe to there, just because I want to get a decent size for the splash. And what I also might do is give it a little bevel. So down here on bevel, I'm just going to go to depth and like, yeah, a 0.01 should be good enough. In fact, let's just move this out and go to solid view to look at that. That looks nice. It'll just give us a little more reflection on the edges when we're rendering this out. So as you can see right now, when this is a text object, we can't actually give it a fluid simulation type. So what we're going to have to do is convert this to a mesh, because right now it's not editable. So all we need to do is you hit space and just type convert to, hit enter, and we're going to do mesh from curve meta surf text. And now this is an editable mesh object. Save. So now you can see we can add, we have the physics tab, we have fluid in the physics tab. I'm going to click that and choose obstacle. And we're just going to do a couple more things. So let's move this down a little bit. And I'm going to maybe move, let's drop this down to like 120. Because we don't, for this tutorial, I don't want it to be too long because it does take quite a while to bake, especially at a higher resolution. You hit home, the home key, it'll kind of center out your timeline. I'm going to move in about 12 frames because I want the fluid down here to settle at the beginning of the simulation. You'll see what I mean once we bake this. So with our fluid object, I'm going to add an I key location. I'm going to move about 8 frames forward on the timeline. And I'll move this down. So GZ, I want to bring this basically down to the bottom of the fluid object. And then I'll hit I location again. So now if you hit Alt A, that'll play the timeline. You can see that moves down with a lot of force, and that'll create a good splash for us. So now what we're going to do is go back to the domain object, and we're going to mess around with some settings. So currently my timeline is 5 seconds long. I'm playing this at 24 frames a second. So down here where time start and end is, that's in seconds. So it's starting at 0 seconds, which is the beginning of our timeline. And it's currently ending at 4 seconds. I'm going to change that to 5. You can adjust that for however long you want your animation to be, which you have to do a little math here, but since I'm doing 24 frames a second, 5 times 24 is 120. So that's how long I need. And then speed, it's at 1 right now, which is basically normal speed. So we're going to change a few other settings. So our resolution right now, 65 is pretty low actually, whereas in the smoke simulator, 64, 65, it's not really high, but it's good enough to get some detail. 65 in the fluid sim is really low actually. So I'm actually going to go up to 120, which even then, that'll look okay, but really I'd say 150, 180, that's going to give you a lot more detail and more splashing and everything. But for these purposes, 120 should be good. There's a few other things we could do. under particles. If we want more particles to be generated, we could turn this up a couple times. 0 is under generate, 0 is off, so it will not generate any particles. I'll bring this up to 1. The problem with particles is if your resolution in the fluid sim isn't high enough, they're going to look really like blocky and not super great, which is usually why I don't turn these on. But just so we can see what it looks like, I'm going to have this on for now. Under world, that's basically the size in like real world scale of our fluid simulation, and it actually doesn't pull from here anymore. You have to go into your world settings over in this tab over here in the scene properties. So we have units. Currently the unit scale is 1. I'll bring that down to 0.5. We can go back to our physics tab. I won't mess too much with this right now. I just kind of want to go over the basics, but these are things that you could play around with to affect how fast your fluid's moving, how thick or how like watery it feels. And another thing is the viscosity down here. And that's going to change how quickly or slowly your fluid moves. So depending on if you want to simulate water, or if you want to simulate something like syrup or honey, that's going to be a lot thicker. So this is another area that you can mess around with. But right now we'll keep those as they are. One other thing I am going to change actually is under the boundary for subdivisions. This is another thing that can affect the look of our fluid in terms of smoothness and how nice it looks. So I'm gonna bring this up to 2. We could close that. I'm not going to go over the partial slip or everything, but basically depending on no slip, partial slip, or free slip, that is how the fluid interacts with the domain itself. But we'll leave those as the default for now. And the last thing we're going to have to do is we're going to bake this. Whereas in the smoke simulator, if I were to hit Alt-A, it would try to show me the simulated smoke without baking anything. It would just go very slowly. In the fluid sim, it will not do that at all. So you actually need to bake the entire simulation before you can see anything, which is time consuming because if you mess something up, you're going to have to bake everything all over again. It's a little frustrating, but that is the way it works. So I'm going to select a folder. All right. And now we are going to bake. So I'll see you in a couple minutes. Okay, so baking has finished. Let's take a look at what we have. So by default, the preview resolution is going to be a lot lower than what our final baked simulation is. So we could actually just change this over here in viewport settings. We're going to change this to final, and you can see already that it's a lot higher resolution. And the other thing I'm going to do is select our fluid object, and I'm going to turn this off both in the viewport render mode and also in the final render because we don't want that rendering. So now we have our fluid. The other thing I'm going to do real quick is just smooth this, shade smooth. And now if we step through our animation, oh yeah, we got plenty of particles here. So you can see that is creating a huge splash. So what I'm going to do is actually line up the camera. That's just Control-Alt-0 on the numpad. And let's do a few things. We could go into rendered view. Right now we're in Eevee. What I'm going to do is change this to a sun lamp, and it defaults to 1000 strength. Let's move that to like 10. Let's move that a little bit rotate that like this. You know what? I'll change it down to 5. All right, so the other thing I'm going to do is probably change my camera to a square. I'll do 1500 by 1500. And I'll get a little closer. What I'm going to do is if I hit N, I could zero it out on the X and on the Z at first. Move a little forward. And we're going to give this a different material. I'm going to give this a glass material, which right now it doesn't really do anything because we don't have anything for it to reflect or see through. For one, go to the world setting, change it from a color to an environment texture. And I'm going to add in an HDRI that I have. You could go over to hdrihaven.com and download. They have a bunch of free downloads that you could grab. I'll leave a link to the website below in the description so that you can find something that works for your scene or that you like. I'm going to actually right now, since I don't want to go into the EV rendering setup for a glass material, I'm just going to be lazy. I'm going to change the render engine from EV over to Cycles, which is a little more taxing, but I think it looks great. And right now the roughness is way too high. So I'm going to go over to our material and I'm just going to change the roughness to like a 0.05. And what I will do is I'm just going to add a ground plane. So I'll add in a plane, scale that up, bring it down on the Z to about there. Let's see, is that wide enough? Yeah. Widen it a little more on the X. And I'll go into edit mode. I'll go to edge, select, extrude up. And I'm going to do Control 3 to add a subdivision surface modifier. And I'm just going to add in an edge loop. Bring it right behind our simulation just so it doesn't start curving up until after that. I'm going to shade smooth on this as well. And what we can do is actually add a couple edge loops on the X. Scale that out just so we don't see any of that curve. Bring that up here. Bring one down here as well. And I'm just going to give this a quick material. Give it like a nice red material. And I'll bring the specular down. In fact, I'll just bring it down to 0. And I'm going to bring the camera a little more forward. I just basically want to cut off the bottom here. So I'll move it in a little bit more. Now in rendered view, I'm going to hit Control B and select our frame just so it's only rendering within our camera. And now we can step through the frames here and see one that looks good. I think I like frame 19. But what I'm actually going to do, we could go into shading right here. And we're going to go over here and select world. And this is showing us our texture for our environment texture. I'm going to actually add, I believe if I hit Control T, it's going to bring a mapping and texture coordinate node. So to be able to do that, you have to have Node Wrangler add-on activated. You could do that by going up to Edit, Preferences, type in Node, and just turn on Node Wrangler. I already have that. And that's going to, I'll do a bunch of stuff for you, but in this case, it's just a quick way to add in some texture coordinate nodes. So now with this, I can rotate along the Z. So I'm going to go into EV real quick just to quickly look at the rotation of our environment HDRI. And now along the Z, I can rotate this until I see like that's getting some good bright reflections on it. So I'm going to try that out. I'm going to go back to cycles. So the other thing I'm going to do real quick is select our text object, and we're going to give that a material. And for that, I'm just going to do a bright like white material with some, say 0.3 for specular, and roughness, I'm going to basically bring that down to 0.05. Let's see if that helps us see it a little better through the fluid. So the one thing I'm noticing about this is our particles are very tiny and they're kind of blocky, like I was saying, since our resolution isn't high enough. So what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to bake this simulation one more time. And this is kind of just part of doing a fluid sim, is refining things once you notice something's not working. So I'm going to bring this up to 150 in the resolution, and down under particles, I'm going to turn tracer off to 0 and generate. I'll also do 0. And now I'll go into bake, and I'm going to bake this one more time, and let's see what that does for us. So I'll see you in a second. Okay, so our bake is done. Let's just kind of scrub through it and take a look. So yeah, I'm liking this a lot more already. The other one just had too many particles and looked kind of messy. You could tell by the scale of this and the viscosity of the fluid, the liquid looks a little large. Like these drops are big compared to the size of the text. It kind of looks like it's not really water, but maybe something a little bit thicker. But that's okay. I think this is just showing you what the default looks like and things you might want to play around with to get a different look. But already looking at this compared to the other one, I just think this looks nicer. I'm going to render this out real quick and just take a look at it. Okay, so I think this looks a lot better. I would still say the resolution's a little too low. This looks like kind of thick blobs of water instead of smaller drops, but I think this is closer to what I'm going for than that last bake. So I'm going to close that, and I'm going to render this out right now. We can take a look at our final fluid sim. Okay, and so this is the final fluid sim. Hopefully you learned, the basics of how to create something like this, and maybe it gave you some ideas to create something much more interesting than this. And if you do, make sure, if you post that on Instagram, make sure to tag me, Thomas Latvies 3D. Give me a follow. I always post my new work on Instagram, and anytime I'm working on a new tutorial. Alright, so that's the basics of the fluid sim in Blender 2.81. So thanks for watching. Make sure to comment below if you have any questions about this tutorial, or if you have ideas for what you'd like to see from me in the future. And make sure to subscribe for more Blender tutorials. Thanks.